So, the past several months, actually I think since January, we were doing an overview of the Bible, right? Genesis through Revelation, and we finished that last week. And so now we are jumping into another section, which is the case for the resurrection. And you might remember that whenever we were doing the whole overview of the Bible, I think I put Unit 4 on that because I was using the units that I had used for whenever I was teaching apologetics to my students. I decided to kind of skip some units just because I really wanted to get this one to y'all because I'm just really passionate about it. Because whenever it comes to defending the faith, for those of y'all who've been with us in 1 Peter, we've already talked about how this type of stuff isn't exactly what Peter had in mind whenever he said that we should give an apologetic for the faith, right? Whenever Peter talks about defending the faith, he's not simply talking about citing historical evidence or scientific evidence for the existence of God, right? What he means is that we need to make sure that our lifestyles reflect what we proclaim to believe, right? That is our defense for the faith. We need to be willing to endure suffering, yada, 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 right? That's what Peter means. However, whenever the Bible does talk about defending the faith in a historical or scientific sense, pretty much every single thing that we have in the Bible asserts to us that there is one key moment in human history on which the legitimacy and the authenticity of the Christian faith hinges, and that's the resurrection. And so, if there was anything that I think we should be able to defend from a historical perspective, it would be the resurrection. And we're going to talk about why today, and basically today what we're going to do is just a big introduction to this unit, right? And then starting next week, we're going to actually go in depth and we're going to actually talk about the actual evidence we have. Whereas today, really what I want to do is I want to explain basically why we're going about this study. And secondly, I want to talk about how we're going to go about this, right? How do you defend an event that happened 2,000 years ago, which claims to be miraculous? Like, how do you even begin to defend that? Right? And so that's really what we're going to be looking at today. And then once we lay the groundwork for that, then starting next week, we'll actually dive in and begin to talk about the stuff itself. But before we actually get into the content itself, I have a video for us to watch. And so this is a video between William Lane Craig and Ben Shapiro. Right? For those of y'all who do not know, William Lane Craig is a Christian apologist, right? AKA he goes about defending the faith, right? Very smart guy. And Ben Shapiro is a political talk show host, right? He's a conservative political talk show host, very famous guy. But most significantly, as it is pertaining to our conversation here, Ben Shapiro is a practicing Orthodox Jew, right? A lot of people don't know that about him, but if you've followed him for a while, you will know this. And that becomes particularly interesting because every now and then Ben Shapiro will have this thing called the Sunday Special, where on Sundays he will release a video where he is having a discussion with various different people, right? They're not always Christians or anything like that. It can be literally anybody, but usually they're talking about matters of faith or lifestyle or something like that, not always just strictly politics. And he did have William Lane Craig on, and over the course of this conversation, William Lane Craig does bring up the topic of the resurrection, and they begin to have a little discussion about it. And so I thought we could kind of start off our whole discussion about the resurrection by watching this video, and then we'll reflect on it and talk about what y'all think, right? And so this video, I think, is about 12 minutes long. And so we're going to click play. Hopefully I can get it to play correctly.
Got this idea of a God that's present in the universe and that has a moral component to him, is the unmoved mover, all of these things. So why do you need the idea of a revelatory God who speaks to human beings?
The arguments that we've discussed already narrow down the field of the world religions to basically the great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or perhaps deism. The question as to which of these is true, I think, stands or falls upon the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was? Jesus claimed to be the decisive self-revelation of God. And I believe that we have good reasons to believe that those claims were true and that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus, were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets. And finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense, even. Right. There are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, "I am God," which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that would be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
Your interpretation, Ben, is this: why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
On the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim there's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s.
Yes.
And there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have, and they still do that 20 years after his death. That's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experienced it. Right. So, especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's sufficient.
I doubt this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up, so I wouldn't know. But the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then
that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. I'm thinking of the ones that Paul transmits to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're on pretty good ground there in terms of the earliness and the multiplicity of our sources for the life of Jesus.
So let's talk for a second about sort of the...
I think that's a really fun discussion, right? And I think that William Lane Craig handled that like a champ. I don't know if any of y'all have ever watched Ben Shapiro before. He's a really smart guy, right? He usually talks super quick, very intelligent person. That's actually why he actually became so popular. It was because he was so quick-witted and fast-talking that people just really liked him. And this is one of the few times I've ever seen a discussion where he genuinely begins to look a little bit stumped, and you can begin to tell by just analyzing his facial movements and like the things he's doing that he's getting a little bit uncomfortable because he realizes the other person has better arguments. I'm sure if you talked to him about that, he would not say that. But there's, I think, some things that highlight this, and I'll talk about them a little bit. But there's really, I guess, three things that I wanted to address before we actually move into the other stuff, just from that conversation. One thing I wanted to highlight is that I think it's like that conversation is really cool because in many ways Ben Shapiro represents the textbook Jew, right? Because I think we've talked about this in the past. Whenever the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, a lot of the different sects of Judaism kind of faded away with it, right? Remember how there were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, all those people, right? Well, the Zealots, they're the ones who led the rebellion against Rome. And so whenever Rome suppressed that rebellion, the Zealots died out. The Essenes, they were some monks living in the wilderness, and they didn't even marry. So they didn't last that long because they didn't repopulate, right? And so they died out. The Sadducees, their power was mainly tied to the temple and their cooperation with Rome. And so once Rome destroyed the temple and they did not have a working relationship anymore, the Sadducees also died out. The Pharisees are the only ones who continued to exist because the Pharisees, by the time the temple was destroyed, they weren't reliant on the temple anymore, right? They primarily emphasized the moral components of the law, and they had started gathering primarily in synagogues outside of the temple. And so once the temple was destroyed, Pharisees continued to exist, and the Pharisee movement became what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism, which has given birth to modern Judaism to this day, right? And so whenever you look at the Pharisees in the New Testament, if you translate that 2,000 years later, that's basically what modern Judaism is. And so whenever you see Ben Shapiro here, he actually looks like the textbook Jew. I'm not saying that physically, I'm saying just his arguments, right? One thing that you'll notice he highlighted very early on is he says, Jesus claiming to be the Messiah is not a punishable offense. And that's 100% correct, right? What he points out there is actually a great argument for the credibility of the Christian testimony about Jesus, right? Because there's a lot of skeptics who will claim that Jesus never claimed to be God, right? But Ben Shapiro here, he recognizes that Jesus obviously had to. Because a lot of people think that Jesus was killed simply because he claimed to be the Messiah. That's not the case, right? Jesus was killed because he claimed to be God, right? And that's what Ben highlights here, right? He says claiming to be the Messiah isn't punishable, right? The Jews want the Messiah. Yes, but the Jews did not expect the Messiah to claim to be God in the flesh, right? And so Ben Shapiro, he is actually responding to Jesus the same way that the religious leaders at Jesus' time did, right? Because they looked at him, and if Jesus had simply claimed to be the Messiah, they probably would have embraced him with open arms. But that's not simply all that Jesus claimed. And so I think that's really cool that even Ben Shapiro, just in hearing the gospel presented, recognizes that Jesus had to claim to be more than the Messiah in order to be handed over to death. I think that's pretty cool, right? But then there's a few other things I want to highlight. Another thing that William Lane Craig highlights is that the context of the resurrection is important, right? Because Ben Shapiro asks, okay, well, why does the resurrection of Jesus prove that he is who he claims to be? Because there's other stories of the resurrections throughout the Bible, right? I mean, if you go back to the Old Testament, Elijah, he resurrected people, right? Elisha, he resurrected people. Jesus himself resurrected other people, right? Jesus resurrected Lazarus. That doesn't mean Lazarus is the Son of God. And so, what is it about the resurrection that proves that Christianity is true? And one thing that William Lane Craig highlights, and this is something that we're going to talk about again as we go into what we're talking about today, is that the religio-social context behind the resurrection of Jesus is the key thing, right? Because what we're going to see is that multiple times throughout Jesus' ministry, he told people that when they killed him, he would rise. And that would be proof that he was who he claimed to be. Also, Jesus made a whole lot of very specific claims about himself. And if there is a God who rules over the universe, and Jesus is lying about his relationship to that God, it would be very misleading for that God to raise Jesus from the dead. Because basically he's giving a seal of approval to Jesus, right? And so the context behind the resurrection is what is so key, right? If Jesus claimed the things he claimed, and if he prophesied the things that he prophesied, and then the resurrection occurs, that changes everything. And so we're going to be looking at that today. The third and final thing that I wanted to highlight, and this is where I think you begin to see the chinks in Ben's argument here, is that towards the end of this video, he kind of begins to stutter a little bit, and he says to Craig, he says, you know what, we could go back and forth on this argument all we want. You could give your arguments, I could give my arguments, but ultimately I find them frankly uninteresting. And he begins to laugh as he says the word uninteresting. And I find that very interesting, because think about the nature of what they're discussing right now, right? William Lane Craig is sitting in front of him. He is sitting in front of an Orthodox Jew saying that he believes he knows the identity of the Messiah, right? The Son of God, the Son of David. And Ben Shapiro, an Orthodox Jew, says that he finds this whole discussion uninteresting. To me, that is proof that Ben Shapiro knows he's losing the argument. Because as a Jewish man who is, yearning for the kingdom of God, the identity of the Messiah should be the thing that he finds the most interesting, right? Even if he doesn't believe that Christ is the Messiah, he should still find it very interesting to hear the evidence. The fact that he laughs as he says uninteresting to me shows that he recognizes he probably doesn't have a good defense here. Because the word uninteresting is not a word that should be muttered by a Jewish person in reference to the identity of the Messiah. You see what I mean there? Right? And so you can tell that he's simply trying to change the conversation somewhere else. Because ultimately, if you're a practicing Jew who genuinely loves the God of Israel and really places your faith in his promises, you cannot choose to find the identity of the Messiah uninteresting, right? And so I just find that very interesting whenever he says that, because it kind of puts his cards on the table, and you can tell he probably is just uncomfortable with where the conversation is heading, and he wants to change the subject, right? And that's why at the very end he kind of throws out one more argument, but it's not a very strong one, and I think William Lane Craig handles that really well. And so I think that's a very good introduction video to what we're going to go through. Because it kind of just gives you a taste of the type of evidence we're going to be talking about. Because Craig, he lists out a few different things. And that's what we're going to be doing too. We're going to be looking at different facts that we can confidently believe about Jesus. And then I'm going to leave it up to you as to whether or not you think that the resurrection best explains those facts. Right? Like I said, we're not going to get into those facts today. That's going to be for later weeks. But today we're going to introduce this stuff to you. Like I said, this is the preliminary matters. Just so you know, these are some useful resources that I used whenever it came to compiling all this stuff. I just like to give credit where credit is due. Mike Licona, he wrote an amazing book called The Resurrection of Jesus. And it's a huge tome, and I read that thing, and it was great. There's also The Crucifixion of Jesus by Joseph Bergeron, I don't know how to pronounce his name. The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. The Fate of the Apostles by Sean McDowell, and Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham. I also referenced other stuff throughout all this as well, but those are the main resources that I used when it came to kind of compiling all this stuff together, and I just wanted to let you know about those. With That being said, here's the big question. Why does the resurrection matter? Right? If the resurrection does not matter, then we don't need to spend any of our time studying this stuff. But I think that whenever you actually examine the Bible, it's very evident that the resurrection is super duper important. And you can actually begin to arrive at this information by looking at the Apostle Paul. Right? According to the Apostle Paul, the resurrection of Jesus is the make or break event for Christianity. If the resurrection didn't happen, then Christianity is false. And if the resurrection did happen, then Christianity is true. We read this in 1 Corinthians 15. And keep in mind, 1 Corinthians 15 is one of the earliest letters that we have in the New Testament. It might even predate some of the Gospels themselves. And like Craig mentioned in that video with Ben Shapiro, there is a passage in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul quotes, and most scholars hold that that passage that he quotes is actually one of the earliest church creeds. And it might date to within 5 years of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, which is really good evidence for us, right? And that's from 1 Corinthians. But in 1 Corinthians 15, this is what Paul says. Now, if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how do some among you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is vain, and your faith also is vain. Moreover, we are even found to be false witnesses of God, because we bore witness against God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You're still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If we have hoped in Christ in this life only, we are of all men most to be pitied. I don't think we can highlight the importance of that paragraph right there enough. Because what Paul is saying right there is that there is proof not only that God exists, but which God exists. Right? And he says that the proof of Christianity centers around the resurrection of Jesus. And I love this because most religions will not encourage you to challenge the faith. Right? Most of them will say, just take it by faith, and whenever they say faith, they mean blind faith. That's not what the Bible means. Right? The Bible ultimately calls us to faith, but it's not a blind faith. It is a faith that is built upon so much solid evidence. Right? The Bible encourages you to ask questions. Right? It encourages you to dig deep, because ultimately, if we are on the side of the truth, we shouldn't be afraid of questions, because if we're on the side of truth, it'll pan out in the end. And so what Paul says here is that if Jesus died and Jesus stayed dead, well, there is no hope for us, right? Because guess what? Like the whole reason we place our faith in Jesus, and the whole reason why the early church and many people even to this day suffer for the faith, well, the whole reason they do that is because they believe that there is a God who is going to right the wrongs that are in this current world, and he is going to usher us into a world without sin, without brokenness, without pain. Right? This is the stuff we were just talking about in Revelation. Right? That's what we believe in. We believe that one day the Son of God is going to return to us and make all things new. But if Jesus died and stayed dead, then our faith means nothing. Right? If Jesus was genuinely just a false Messiah, if Jesus was simply a carpenter from Nazareth who built up a following, was crucified by Rome, and his body just decayed away in a tomb, well, then we need to close up all our churches, and we need to go find a different religion, right? Because if that's all that Jesus was, why would we follow him, right? He's nothing but a false Messiah. Does that make sense? Right? But if Jesus, that random homeless carpenter from Nazareth, died and came back to life, well, that's kind of proof that God is with him. Right? Especially whenever you look at the claims Jesus made. We're going to get to that in a second. And so Paul says, if Jesus died and stayed dead, our faith is in vain. Let's close our churches, let's close down our private Christian schools, and let's just go find some other religion or just turn to atheism. Right? Even though you'll notice that Paul never even considers atheism an option because it's so evident that God exists. Right? He says, worst comes to worst, we are found to be false witnesses of God. Right? So he says there is a God who exists, and he's pretty confident that the Jewish God is that God. But it really comes down to, do we follow Jesus or do we follow the rest of the Jews? Right? Well, if Jesus came back to life, we follow Jesus. Right? Because that proves that he is who he claimed to be. And so he says, if we have hoped in Christ in this life only, we are of all men most to be pitied. Because think about it. What are we called to do as Christians? Deny ourselves. pick up our cross, follow after Christ. We are called to suffer, if need be, for the sake of Christ. And so if there is no afterlife, if there is no eternity where we're going to dwell with God forever, that means we are denying ourselves all the luxuries this world has to offer for nothing. And so he says, yeah, if there is no eternity, we are of all people most be pitied, because we're denying ourselves for nothing. We are willing to suffer for nothing. What we should go do is eat and drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Right? He says, if Christ died and stayed dead, then let's go party and let's go do all the sinful things we want to do, because you know what? It doesn't matter anyways. But if Christ raised from the dead, then we should do exactly what he commanded, and we should walk in obedience to him. Right? And so, according to the Apostle Paul, the resurrection is the make or break moment, and so we should look into whether or not there's evidence for it. And then Jesus himself agrees with this, right? When confronted about his identity, Jesus consistently pointed to the resurrection as the event that would prove that he was who he claimed to be, right? We see this throughout the Gospels. In John chapter 2, this is whenever Jesus goes into the temple, right? You know the scene well, right? Jesus goes into the temple and he finds that they basically turned the thing into a marketplace. Right? And he shows up, he starts flipping tables, and he says, "What have you done to my Father's house?" Right? And the people are evidently shocked because, Jesus just walked into God's house and he said that it was his Father's house. Right? That's kind of a weird thing to do. Right? Imagine me showing up at the White House and acting like I own the place. I don't own the place. Right? And you know what somebody would ask? They would say, "Give me your credentials to prove that you belong here." So that's exactly what they say to Jesus, right? The Jews then said to him, "What sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things?" Right? If you're going to barge into the temple and act like this is your dad's house and you own this place, you need to prove it to us, right? What is the proof that you are who you claim to be? Jesus answered them, "Destroy this sanctuary, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews said, "It took 46 years to build the sanctuary, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the sanctuary of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. All right, so you see what Jesus does there? They say, "What is the proof that you are who you claim to be? What is the proof that you are the Son of God and that you have the right to call this temple your Father's house?" And he says, "Kill me and wait 3 days." So according to Jesus, if they kill him, and if 3 days later he raises up, that is proof who he claims to be. And he said this before his resurrection, right? And so that means that whenever he dies, they're going to keep their eye on that. And we're going to see that that's exactly what the authorities do, right? And what's interesting is that it's not John's gospel that records that the authorities took notice of this, right? Instead, it's one of the other gospels that highlights that, which shows you that this isn't John later on just making this up, right? No, the gospels are unified in the idea that even the enemies of Jesus recognized that he had made this claim about himself, right? And so that proves to us that this isn't just like Christians later on being like, "Ooh, let's insert a fake prophecy." No. Like they all agreed that this is what had happened with the enemies of Jesus. Another interesting thing about that story right there is if you just think about what Jesus is claiming here and how they're misunderstanding it, they think that he is literally talking about destroying the temple itself, right? So from their perspective, this guy sounds like a madman, right? Once again, imagine if I were to walk into the White House and they were saying, "What's your proof that you belong here?" And I said, "Blow this place up." They'd probably lock me up and throw me in prison because I sound like a terrorist. But that's what Jesus says, "Destroy this temple." And they don't understand what he's saying. They're like, "Bro, it took us 46 years to work on this thing." Because under Herod the Great, they'd basically been doing all these renovations. So they misunderstand him. But the main thing is that Jesus says, "Kill me and wait 3 days. That's my proof that I am who I claim to be." We see a very similar thing whenever we get to Matthew. And then we also see a similar account whenever you go later in Matthew and also in Luke. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered and said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." Right? And in the context, the reason they want to see a sign from him is once again to prove he is who he claims to be. Right? If you go back to Deuteronomy, remember whenever you had the sign of the prophet? Right? The sign of the prophet was that if they are prophesying something, they will give you a sign to confirm that they are from God. And so they ask, "We want a sign from you." But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation eagerly seeks for a sign, and yet no sign will be given but the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So, once again, it's the same exact thing. People say, what is the sign that you are who you claim to be? And Jesus says, the sign of Jonah. Right? Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the fish. I'm going to be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Right? I'm going to die and I'm going to raise. Right? So he says, that is the sign that I am who I claim to be. So, several times throughout the Gospels, this is what Jesus says. Right? This is the proof that he is who he claims to be. So we have both Paul and Jesus asserting the resurrection is the big deal. It's the main thing. Not only this, but Jesus explicitly predicted his death and resurrection on several occasions during his ministry. Thus, the historical reality of the resurrection confirms his identity as a prophet, which then ratifies all the other claims he made concerning himself. Here's the logic here. Right? Once again, if you go back to Deuteronomy, right, to the same thing I was talking about, the test of the prophet, right? God says that the prophet will not only give you a sign, but what he'll do is whenever he says that something will come to pass, and that thing comes to pass, it is proof that he is from God. Well, Jesus does exactly this, right? Several times he predicts exactly what's going to happen, and that is exactly what happens, right? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke record all three of these instances. So it seems like it was just well known at that time period that there were 3 separate times where Jesus explicitly talked about his death and resurrection. Matthew chapter 16, this is immediately after Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. Remember that scene at Caesarea Philippi whenever Jesus says, who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. Do y'all remember that story from the Gospels? Mm-hmm. Well, immediately following that, we read, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised up on the 3rd day. All right, you go to the next chapter of Matthew. And while they were gathering together in Galilee, Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and he will be raised on the 3rd day. And they were deeply grieved. You go a few chapters later. And as Jesus was about to go up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves. And on the way, he said to them, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem. And the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will deliver him over to the Gentiles to mock and flog and crucify him. And on the 3rd day, he will be raised up. All right, so there's 3 separate occasions that Jesus prophesied this. And the really cool thing about this is that, once again, they're recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And people will debate, and they'll say, oh, well, maybe Christians later on came and, they just made this up. Maybe they just later on said, oh yeah, Jesus prophesied this would happen. I know Mike Winger on YouTube has a very good video where he actually breaks down the evidence that we have that each of these are true. And so I would encourage you to go look at that. But also, there's just, first off, you got to realize that even if you don't believe the Bible is is the Word of God, which obviously we do, but even if you say the Bible is just a historical document, well, it's a historical document, right? So you have 3 separate historical documents dating to within a few decades of Jesus' life, all of which affirm that this thing happened 3 times. That's pretty good evidence that it actually happened, right? And what's added to the evidence here is that despite Jesus predicting this 3 times, each of the Gospels also affirms that the disciples didn't believe it, right? And so if they were simply making this stuff up, you would expect that they would also make up that they believed him as well, because that would make them look better, right? Because people are less likely, we'll talk about this in a little bit, people are less likely to make up stuff that makes them look bad, right? You know, if I were to tell you that I peed myself last week, well, in this case, that is false. But in general, if somebody says that, it suggests that it's probably true because you're less likely to make up a story about you peeing yourself, right? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Right? And so they record that this happened 3 times, but they also record that they didn't understand it. And despite him explicitly telling them what was going to happen, they didn't believe it, right? And so that would add to the evidence that these were genuine prophecies that did actually happen. And so whenever Jesus does resurrect, not only does it prove that he is the Son of God, but it proves that he's a prophet, in which case all his words are ratified anyways, right? Because a prophet speaks the truth, right? So that's really cool. And not only that, but this goes to the whole thing I mentioned earlier, even Jesus' enemies recognize the centrality of the resurrection, right? Matthew 27, this is right after Jesus dies. Now on the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I am to rise again.' Therefore, order for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come and steal him away and say to the people, 'He is risen from the dead.' And the last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard, go. Make it as secure as you know how." And they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. So the Gospels record that even his enemies, they recognize that this is a central thing. And once again, you could reply to this and you could say, well, how do we know that the Gospel authors didn't just make this up? Well, that'd be a really random thing to make up, because all you would have to do, especially, because once again, remember, the Gospel of Matthew was written in the 1st century. If somebody had made this up, all the original readers would have to do? Go and ask them, right? All you would have to do is go and ask them, did you know about this, right? And sure enough, whenever you actually look at the Jewish accounts of stuff, there are Jewish reports about there's this guy named Jesus, and he was a sorcerer and all this stuff, right? And so it's very interesting. Like, they wouldn't have good reason to make this up because it could so easily be falsified. And it just puts them in a very weird place. But even the enemies of Jesus, they recognize Jesus claimed, "I am to rise again." And so they recognize that that'd be a big problem for them. And so they went and sealed the tomb, right? Because they wanted to make sure Jesus was not going to get out of there. You know what the issue is? He did get out of there. Which then leads to Matthew chapter 28. This is right before the end of Matthew, after the resurrection. "Now while they were on their way, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened, namely that the resurrection happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and took counsel together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'You are to say his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this is heard before the governor, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble.' And they took the money and did as they had been instructed, and this story was widely spread among the Jews as it is to this day." All right. So not only do we see that the enemies recognized how important the resurrection was, or would be, but we realize that as soon as they learn about it, they try to conceal it. And once again, you could say, oh, these are just Christians making this up, right? Maybe they're just making up the fact that the Jews were trying to conceal this. Well, do you see the evidence in there that would suggest that Matthew's not making this up? Look at the final words. "And is to this day." Yep. So according to Matthew, at the time that he's writing this, his readers would be familiar with the fact that this was a lie that was being spread by the Jews, right? So you want to know what the easiest way to prove this false would be? If Matthew said, "as it is to this day," and a Jewish person reading this would say, "I never heard of any rumor like that." But Matthew says, this has been a lie that they've spread amongst the Jews as to this day, and a Jewish reader could read this and say, "Yeah, I've heard that. I heard from somebody that people were claiming that the disciples stole the body." And then you could argue and respond, well, how do we know the disciples didn't steal the body? Well, and we'll talk about this later on, follow the logic here. If the disciples did steal the body, then what does that mean the disciples know?
That he rose from the grave?
Well, no, if they stole the body. If the disciples stole the body, that means that they know Jesus did not raise from the grave, right? Because that means he was still dead. And then you would have to answer the question, if the disciples know that they are preaching a lie, and they know that Jesus did not raise from the grave, why did they go on to die for their faith? Because it's one thing to die for something that you believe to be true, it's another thing to die for something that you know to be false. And so, once again, it rings with authenticity. Right? It seems to be true that after Jesus supposedly resurrected, the Jewish leaders spread a lie that the disciples stole the body.
Can I share an apologetic? I want to share a quote.
Okay.
Recently, a politician associated with Nixon, back in the day, he said about Watergate, they couldn't keep some of the greatest men in the country couldn't keep a lie straight for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
How could 12 disciples keep a lie going for 40 years? That just doesn't add up.
Yeah, especially whenever the church, within a few weeks of this stuff, grew to several thousand. And keep in mind, we're going to talk about this later on too. What city was the church born in? Where did Pentecost happen?
I want to say Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yes. Also, question: where did Jesus die at? What city? Jerusalem. All right. So Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. A month and a half later, the church is born in Jerusalem. You know what would have been the easiest way to prove that Jesus did not rise from the dead? Show a body, right? But that doesn't happen, right? It seems like nobody argues. Like nowadays, people will argue and say, "Oh, the tomb wasn't empty." Okay, well, it's easy to say that 2,000 years later, but nobody at that time was claiming that, right? Even the Jewish people right here, notice that none of them go to try to produce a body. Everybody agrees that the tomb is empty. They're simply debating about how it became empty. You see the difference there?
Yep.
That's really important. We're going to talk about that again later in a few weeks. But that's just going to the logic that we're working through here, that's how we're going to be looking at this stuff, right? Because what you see is that the Gospels, they don't seem to be fabricating anything. They seem to be reporting historical fact. And so here's the conclusions we can come to. If Jesus rose from the dead, that confirms firstly that God is real, right? Because first, just if you're looking at it face value, that is a supernatural occurrence, right? People don't naturally rise from the dead, right? Can we all agree on that, right? Yes. The natural way of things is that whenever you die, you stay dead. Technically, you don't need resurrection to prove God is real, because I think that life itself is proof that God is real, because, creation itself testifies the existence of God. But let's just assume that life wasn't enough. If somebody dies and rises from the dead, regardless of who they are, that proves that God is real, right? Because it proves that there is a supernatural force who, when he decides to, can step into the natural world and do some work. Does that make sense? All right, so firstly, God is real. But not only is God real, but the God of the Bible is the God of creation, because it proves to us which God is real, mainly because of the claims that Jesus made about himself, right? Jesus was a person who worshipped the God of Israel, right? He was a Jew. And so, if Jesus dies as a Jewish person worshiping the God of Israel, and Jesus raises from the dead, that proves not only that God is real, but the God of the Bible is the God who is real. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And not only does it prove that God is real, not only does it prove that the God of the Bible is the one who created all things, but it also proves that Jesus is who he claimed to be. And whenever you look at the evidence, as Ben Shapiro so clearly pointed out for us, Jesus didn't simply claim to be the Messiah. He claimed to be God himself, right? And if Jesus' resurrection proves all these things, then we can also prove that Christianity is true. That's really important. That's why I say the resurrection is the central thing that we need to defend when it comes to apologetics. Because what I've seen whenever it comes to most apologetics is people waste their time on so many side things, right? And it's not that these are bad things, they're just not as important to me, right? People will give you 30 arguments for the existence of God. You know what the issue with that is? Well, okay, you've given me 30 arguments for the existence of God, but that doesn't prove that the Christian God is the correct God. All you've done is prove to me that theism is correct. And that means that the only thing you've disproved is atheism. You know what the issue is with that? A very small percentage of the world are atheists. Okay, so you just gave me 30 arguments for why atheists are wrong, but now I've got to figure out which one of the religions is correct. And a lot of religions believe in God, and so the majority of humans would agree that, yeah, those arguments are good. What I love about the resurrection is that not only does it prove that God exists, but it tells you which God exists, and it proves to you that Christianity is the true religion. And so, if you can defend the resurrection, you don't even need all the other stuff, right? The other stuff is just icing on the cake. But if you can have, the things that we're going to talk about in this study, if you can have those in your head and just memorize them, boom. If somebody ever comes up to you and says, "Why are you a Christian?" Well, you can say, "Well, I've placed my faith in Jesus Christ, and I've trusted him as my Lord and Savior, and I'm committed to him and serving him as my King." And they would say, "Why? Right? Why Christianity and nothing else?" And you would say, "Well, I believe Jesus rose from the dead." "What evidence do you have for that?" "I'm glad you asked." And then you could just cite the evidence. right? And so if you can defend this, boom, good. Like, to me, I think that if you can defend the resurrection, all the other apologetic stuff is just extra stuff you don't really need as much. And you can actually devote your attention to the stuff that matters more, like living a godly life, right? Because I know a lot of people who they can defend the existence of God and all that stuff, and they can give you a bunch of philosophical, historical, scientific evidence and stuff like that, but their lives aren't reflecting the gospel, right? They're very smart and puffed up with knowledge, but their lives don't look how God wants them to look. And so I would much rather you just devote your attention to this, so that once you have that in your head, you can devote the rest of your time to actually living for God, right? And so now we have to answer a super important question. How do we even defend the resurrection of Jesus? Because I don't know if you noticed, but we're kind of 2,000 years removed from the event. And ultimately, it comes down to how to be a historian, right? And the main reason I say this is because one thing, like whenever you go to school, we live in a world that is primarily, our culture, above everything, it values science, right? That's what our culture loves. And so whenever you go to school, you learn a thing called the scientific method, right? And what is the scientific method? Like, give me some of the steps of the scientific method. Do y'all remember them?
Observation.
What's the first thing you have to do?
Something about hypothesis.
Yes, you have to develop a hypothesis, right? A hypothesis is a theory, right? And then what you do, basically, just to condense it all down, you have to test that theory and see whether it's true or not. And you have to test it several times, and you have to repeat it over and over again in order to prove whether or not it's true, right? And then, once you've done all that stuff, you arrive not at scientific fact, you arrive at scientific theory. Because there's always the possibility it's wrong. The issue with that is that you can't really do that with history, right? And so in our schools, we teach people the scientific method, but we don't teach them the historical method, right? Because you know what the issue is with history? You can't just repeat it, right? You can't simply with science, if I'm wanting to test that gravity works, I can pick up this remote, I can grab a stopwatch, I can drop it, check the time. Drop it, I can drop it, record it, I can repeat that over and over again, I can change the circumstances, I can do all that to test a scientific theory. We can't time travel back in history to prove that Jesus existed, that he did all that stuff, right? But it's not just with Jesus, right? Technically, I can't prove that Ben was at church today. I mean, I saw him there, but I can't prove it to y'all. Y'all have to take it by faith, right? And so, ultimately, unless we could time travel back, I'm the only one who knows that Ben was at church today, and y'all two weren't there to see him, right? Yes?
I got a random fact to counter with. You know where it says, reminds me of the battle where the sun stood still? You know when Jesus was crucified, and wasn't there a moment the sun, the sky?
It just says it got dark.
Yeah. There's a random way to trace back the with NASA and the stars, to that exact date where that occurred.
According to some people, but people still debate about the date, right? Because ultimately, when it comes down to it, the Bible doesn't exactly tell us what happened there. It just says it got dark. People read into that, and they say, "Oh, it must have been like a solar eclipse or something like that."
Yeah, that's weird.
It doesn't necessarily say that though. It could just be that it was super cloudy, right? The Bible doesn't inherently tell us exactly what happened there. Same thing with the Star of Bethlehem, right? People will say, "Oh, what was it was some sort of thing." For all we know, it could have literally been an angelic being taking the form of a supernatural light. That people read their theories into stuff, but we can't prove that because we're reading stuff into the Bible, right? Ultimately, what we have to do is we have to look at the historical evidence that we have, and we have to figure out what seems to be true. And we do this with everything, right? Every history textbook you've ever read has to look at the evidence to determine what is true, right? The issue is, once again, in our schools, they don't teach you the historical method, they just teach you the scientific method, because that's what we mainly value in our culture, right? And so a lot of people, they look at the stuff of Jesus and they're like, "Oh, well, I'm not going to believe in a miracle unless I can see it with my own eyes," because they want something that you can replicate. But that's not how history works, right? And so what we have to do is we have to figure out, how do we even determine what is historical, right? Because if we weren't taught this in school, well, how do historians do this, right? And so what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of talk about how to be a historian, right? And I'm going to explain that to you so that next week we can put on our historical goggles and we can look at the evidence and try to determine what we believe to have happened. Right? Does that make sense?
I have a question. Is there maybe a modern lens of history and an ancient lens of history? Or today we want like a scientific, there were 3 people on Tuesday, here's a picture, versus a more ancient style of history that isn't in our current way of looking at it?
I would say maybe to a degree it's kind of like that, but I would say that we're moving further away from that now, because now we live in an age where pictures can be photoshopped and videos can be photoshopped and stuff. And so even nowadays, even if 1 million people saw it, people are still more critical of things because you never know if things can be doctored, right? And so in general, there is a general air of skepticism about history nowadays where people will question if anything happened, right? They'll be like, did the moon landing happen? Was 9/11 an inside job? Right? People are naturally inclined to conspiracy theories, right? Because they're intriguing and they're interesting. And so what we need to do is we need to just look at the information we know about Jesus, and we need to determine what to say about the resurrection. And what's going to be really cool about this is that ultimately what we're going to do over the course of the next few weeks is I'm going to give you 5 facts that practically every historian agrees about Jesus. And there's going to be some fringe historians or like YouTube atheists who are going to get on there. They're going to say Jesus never existed.
That's a good point about people's current skepticism is if they don't trust today's history, what happened 100 years ago, why would they have a reliability for things happening in ancient past?
Exactly. But there's going to be some people who are obviously the exception to the rule, and you're going to find people on YouTube who say Jesus never existed.
Right.
But by and large, any serious New Testament scholar, whether they're Christian or atheist or agnostic or Buddhist or whatever, they will all agree that Jesus existed. And there are 5 facts surrounding his crucifixion and resurrection that practically all of them agree on. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the evidence of those 5 facts. And then I'm going to tell you what conclusion that leads me to. And then you can land at whatever conclusion you lead to. But obviously, since I'm a Christian, I believe that the thing that best explains those facts is the resurrection of Jesus. Right? But let me explain exactly how we're going to get there. So let's talk about some key definitions when it comes to historical study. First off, the term horizon. Right? A horizon is our way of viewing things as a result of knowledge, experience, beliefs, education, cultural conditions, preferences, presuppositions, and worldview. What this means is, if you think about it like this, right? Imagine all of us were to go to the beach together, right? And all 4 of us are standing on the edge of the beach, looking out at the horizon, and by and large, we're all seeing the same thing. But if George is standing 10 feet to my left, his view of the horizon is going to be slightly different than mine, right? Now, if Ben is standing 3 miles to the right, well, his horizon is going to be even more different than mine and George's, right? And if Paul is standing up on top of a skyscraper, well, he's going to be able to see even further, right? And so we're all looking at the same thing, but we're looking at it from different angles and perspectives. And that's not only true whenever we look at physical horizons, but it's true whenever we look at history. Right? Naturally, whenever we examine history, we are predisposed to believe in the things that line up with what we already believe. Right? And so whenever an atheist looks into the historical evidence for Jesus, they're naturally going to be inclined towards whatever evidence leads them away from the resurrection having happened. Because if you think about it, an atheist does not believe that God exists. And therefore, whenever an atheist examines the evidence, well, he's going to naturally favor whatever evidence proves that God does not exist. Right? And as Christians, the opposite is true. As Christians who believe that God exists and who want the resurrection to have happened, naturally, we're going to favor those things that lead us to that conclusion. Right? And so that's something we need to be aware of, and we'll talk about that in a second. Right? But that's what a horizon is. Right? All of us has different worldviews that affect everything. Right? Depending on what type of dad you had, that can determine how you view fatherhood. Right? Depending on your relationship to music, that's going to affect what type of music you like, right? And so all of us come from different backgrounds. We're all different people. We all view things in different ways. And that's something you need to be super aware of when it comes to studying history, right? Because the little different things that make us who we are going to shape what we believe, right? And we need to be aware of that so that we're aware of our biases and we can kind of try to set them aside as we approach this, right? We'll talk about that again in a second. Historical fact. A historical fact is something that happened, and that historians attempt to discover through verification procedures, right? So ultimately, like I said, the only way we know that something actually happened is really if we physically saw it ourselves, in which case we really can't prove it to anybody else other than simply giving as much evidence as possible, or if we could literally time travel and just bring everybody with us and show them that it happened, right? Those are really the only ways to prove undeniably that something happened. But whenever we say historical fact, what we're saying is that whenever you look at all the evidence, everything that we have seems to confirm that this did factually happen, right? And that's usually whenever you look in your history textbooks, that's usually the stuff we're dealing with, right? There's always going to be myths and legends about people, right? Did George Washington actually chop down the cherry tree? The world may never know, right? But there's certain things we know about George Washington that did factually happen, right? And so sometimes the history textbooks will share a little story, but they'll say, we don't know if this actually happened, right? But historians, their main goal is to examine the evidence and figure out what is historical fact, right? All right. And this is where, oh, hold up. Got a little notification on my laptop here that's getting in the way. All right. Burden of proof. This is super important. This is going to determine how you approach evidence. Right? There are 3 different ways a historian can approach a text. The first one is what we call methodical credulity, right? And I'll elaborate on this a little bit, but you're going to hear some big words here. Methodical credulity assumes that texts are reliable unless they indicate that they should be regarded as otherwise, aka innocent until proven guilty. This is the best method when the intention, method, and integrity of the author are known, right? Basically what that's saying is that whenever you are approaching historical stuff with methodical credulity, you are assuming that these people are telling the truth, right? Naturally, this is what Christians do whenever they read the Bible, right? We go into it and we just assume that these people are telling the truth. As historians, though, that's not always the best case, right? Like it mentions here, that's best to do when the intention, method, and integrity of the author are known. If you know the person is trustworthy, then it's easier to assume they're telling the truth. However, let's go back to Genesis chapter 3, right? Eve was she was very unwise and she was very foolish in giving methodical credulity to the serpent, right? Because she assumed that the serpent was telling the truth when in reality he was deceiving her, right? And so you don't always want to be methodical, you don't want to always assume that they're being credible, right? Or that not all sources are worth listening to, is what I'm trying to say. Right? Think about this. For those who are on social media, which it might mainly just be me, but we all probably have an aunt or an uncle who is like this, right? Who they'll go share a post, and it's like the most fringe conspiracy theory ever, but because they read it online, they assume it is true, right? They're like, did you know that the government is actually filled with aliens? It's like, it's not true, but they read it, and they just assumed it was true. Right? And we roll our eyes, but ultimately what that is we see that your aunt or uncle is practicing methodical credulity, right? They read something and they just assumed it was true without actually fact-checking, right? At times, methodical credulity can be good, but it's not always the best, right? On the other hand, you've got methodical skepticism, which is the exact opposite, right? Methodical skepticism assumes that texts are unreliable unless they indicate that they should be regarded as reliable, aka guilty until proven innocent. You will notice that this is how most atheists or how most skeptics will approach the Bible, right? They will go into the Gospel of Matthew and they will say, I do not believe that any of this is true, and I do not believe it was written by Matthew, and it has to prove to me that it's true, and it has to prove that it's written by Matthew. You see how that's a bit of an issue? Because whenever Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, he wasn't really going about, he wasn't trying to prove that he was the author. He was simply writing his book. And so what the atheists and skeptics are doing is they are placing a burden on Matthew's gospel that Matthew wasn't even seeking to attempt to do, right? And so that's a bit of an issue, right? We naturally do that, though, whenever it comes to atheist arguments, right? We assume, you're just wrong. Well, that's not always good either, right? Sometimes whenever it comes to methodical skepticism, this is where you end up getting a bunch of people in tinfoil hats and they're conspiracy theorists. Right? I know it. This is where you get people saying, everybody's telling you that the world is round, but I'm telling you the world is flat, and there's a secret conspiracy about all this, right? People who are flat earthers, they are expressing methodical skepticism.
I
right? They are assuming that everybody is lying to them.
I would say that's why I'm thinking, the assumption that is like in skepticism with the supernatural, with religion. The circular logic is there are no miracles because, that's science. What is science? Science is what assumes there are no such things as miracles. And just circles back, you're so skeptical you can't take in more information that would disprove.
Yes.
We've already assumed it to be true.
Yeah, and we're actually going to talk about that again in a second because we're going to talk about how to transcend the horizons. But ultimately, the approach that we're going to take when it comes to this is we are going to take an approach of methodical neutrality. And that sounds just like what you would think, right? If credibility is assuming that things are true unless they prove themselves false, and if skepticism is assuming things are false until they prove themselves true, neutrality is simply just letting the text speak for itself, right? Methodical neutrality is when the one making the claim bears the burden of proof. All historians bear the responsibility of defending their hypothesis, right? So whenever you're being neutral about this, even if you're a Christian, you're not approaching the Bible as a Christian, right? You're simply saying, okay, I'm a Christian, but I'm going to set that over to the side, and I'm simply going to approach the Bible as a historical text, right? Even though you believe, obviously, the Bible is the Word of God, just for the sake of historicity, you're setting your beliefs over there because you're trying to be as unbiased as possible. Does that make sense? Yes. Right? You're just trying to be neutral, right? Because you don't the thing is, we don't want our beliefs to blind us, right? I don't want to simply be a Christian because I want to be a Christian, right? No, that's an issue, right? I should want to be a Christian because it is true, right? And so in order to seek truth, I need to try my best to set aside my biases. And so the best thing to do is just approach it from a neutral perspective, right? Don't assume the Bible's telling the truth. Don't assume the Bible's lying. Simply approach the Bible and let the Bible defend itself. And the cool thing is that I think as a Christian, we got really good evidence for it, right? This leads us to the question, how do we transcend our horizons, right? If each of us has a worldview, a bias, a belief that shapes the way that we view things, how do we overcome that, right? If we're wanting to be neutral, how do we actually achieve neutrality? Because that's really difficult to do. It is extremely difficult to be unbiased in this world, right? Because naturally we have convictions, we have beliefs, and it's hard to approach this, right? How do we actually approach the topic of Jesus without being so drawn to wanting to prove it's true? Yes?
And I would also want to say that it's difficult because there are times in my life where I feel like if I were to put anything aside, and this is just from my personal experience, but basically I would just I would have the fear of losing it for the rest of my life. I don't know if that's how it actually works, though.
Yeah.
But does it work like that for usually? Just making sure.
I'm not totally sure what you mean by that, but
losing it forever, as in just never remembering it, and it almost being erased from your mind.
Yep.
So,
I still don't fully get what you're going for, but
well, maybe later.
Yeah, it's all right. We can talk about it later and try to figure it out. Okay, so what we're going to do right now is we're going to just kind of give tips on how to transcend horizons, right? How do we overcome our biases and try to get it so that all of us are looking at something from the same perspective, right? Because that's the crazy thing, right? Imagine, let's go to the beach scenario again, right? Let's imagine that I stood and I looked at the horizon from one perspective, and then I moved and George stood in the exact same spot. That doesn't guarantee that he's viewing it from the same perspective, right?
We got to collect the remember the blue dress, white dress situation?
Yes.
And the audio, Yanni or whoever it was?
Yes.
The audio one too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, people are just, they're shaped by that. How do you overcome that? Yes.
I got an example. This makes me think of, because I like riding on airplanes, everybody that sits at a window seat has a different perspective. Because one person may be looking out of his window at something outside the window, but somebody at a different seat may see something different.
Some people see a flat
so it's
some
like,
people see a
so it's like,
yeah,
you're seeing
exactly.
things.
And so our goal is to, as historians, our goal is to try to transcend the horizons, right? Obviously, as Christians, we want the resurrection to be true, but we're not approaching this from a Christian perspective, right? We're approaching this from a historian perspective, and the cool thing is that I think as a historian, it leans towards Christianity. But we'll examine that as we get there, right? And so here's a few ways that we can work on transcending our horizons. First off, your method, right? Your method of approaching history. It helps you achieve greater objectivity by encompassing the manner in which data is reviewed, weighed, and contextualized, criteria for testing the adequacy of hypotheses, and fair consideration of competing hypotheses. What that means is this, right? Remember how we talked about the scientific method, right? And the scientific method, you have a step-by-step process by which you're trying to determine scientific theory, right? You develop a hypothesis, you test it, you evaluate it, you retest it if you have to, yada, 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 right? That's the scientific method. Well, historians also have to develop a method, right? Because what you do is if you can develop a method and you can approach all things from that method, well, it'll make it easier to make sure that you're not being blinded by other stuff, right? Because in that step-by-step method, you can try to account for overcoming biases, right? And this will make more sense whenever we actually talk about what our method's going to be, right? So we'll talk about that in a second. But what I'm saying is that if you have a solid historical method, it'll help you be able to overcome that bias. And so we'll talk about the method in a second, but that's just one thing that we're going to be doing to help overcome the bias. Secondly, peer pressure, right? Peer pressure isn't always good, but in history it is. Peer pressure is an aid in objectivity because it serves as a check on one's bias and can serve to minimize the effects of the horizon. At the same time, when a consensus of scholars favor certain hypotheses, peer pressure can be a hindrance by preventing people from seriously considering other options due to fear of going against the majority, right? So peer pressure can be a good and a bad thing, right? For instance, ultimately it's good in general, right? Because it forces you to question things, right? Whenever I was writing my master's thesis, right? Just so you know, the majority consensus amongst New Testament scholars currently is that of the four Gospels, Mark was written first, right? That's the majority consensus, right? For me, though, when I was writing my master's thesis, I was actually arguing that Matthew was written first. And this is where peer pressure is helpful, right? Because I realized that I am arguing against the majority, and that means that my arguments need to be really good, because if a bunch of people are looking at this, it needs to be able to out-argue them, right? And so peer pressure is helpful, right? Because it forces me to not be biased. Because I have to realize, okay, like if I'm trying to make an argument, I have to realize, ooh, that argument won't work for them, but it'll work for them. Okay, well that must be a biased argument, right? And so I'm having to shape my argument so that it will stand the test of peer pressure, right? If 10 people are going to be examining my argument, I need to have a solid argument. Right? If it's only one person looking at it, well, I might be able to get away with some stuff. But the more people who are going to be examining your argument, the better you will be at overcoming your biases. What it says here, though, is that sometimes there is an issue where such a majority begins to hold a position that people are just blinded to considering other possibilities. And that's what we have, what I would say, with the Matthew-Mark thing, right? To where the argument that Mark was written first, that originally was a position held primarily by liberal scholars, right? And the reason why they held that is because if you look at the Gospels, Mark is the shortest one, right? And you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all of which are very similar to one another. And for a liberal scholar who doesn't believe that the Bible is the Word of God, they naturally believe that the Gospels were expanded upon. And so they said Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke, they both had Mark, and they expanded on them, right? The issue is, that became such a majority opinion that now even conservative scholars have begun to hold that. But they've almost forgotten why they held that, right? Like that was originally a liberal position, but conservatives have just kind of begun to accept it because that's just what people think. But the issue is, like whenever I was writing my paper, I was like, guys, whenever you actually look at the majority of evidence that we have, it suggests Matthew was written first. The only reason you would believe Mark is written first is if you trust the majority of scholars, right? And so that's where peer pressure can be a bad thing. Right? Because sometimes it's just easier to conform to the crowd, right? Nobody likes to be the one pushing buttons and going against the crowd. And so sometimes peer pressure can be a bad thing in historical stuff, but in general it's helpful, right? Because in general it'll help you refine your argument, but sometimes it does just people start waving the white flag and they surrender and just kind of bow their knee.
Is peer pressure the same argument used as you read the majority text, like you're looking for errors in the Bible copies. They make copies, and you have 4 different copies, and 3 of them say one thing, and you have one outlier. You know the correct reading of the text just by what's most common, the majority text.
Well, kind of. So with textual criticism, it's a little bit different because there's more doesn't necessarily mean it's better, because it could be that most of the copies were written centuries later, in which case you have more of one and less of the other, but the older one was the original, right? So with textual criticism, it's a little bit different, but that's something we can talk about later. All right, thirdly, submitting ideas to unsympathetic experts. This kind of ties in But whenever you submit your ideas to people who don't agree with you, this assists in producing objectivity because it requires one to submit their interpretations and hypotheses to those who are certain to have different opinions and thus are more likely to find weaknesses, blind spots, or inconsistencies in one's hypothesis. Right? For instance, whenever I wrote my master's thesis, right, defending that Matthew was written first, I submitted that to a guy, and my professor who graded it, he actually believes that Mark was written first. And so he ultimately disagreed with my position, but you know what the cool thing is? Throughout the paper, he was annotating it, and he was explaining why he disagreed with certain things. And so that's helpful, because that allowed me to see whether or not I was being biased, or maybe he was being biased, and it helped me kind of begin to see some of the different horizons and stuff like that, right? And so you don't want to simply... this is the danger of only surrounding yourself by people who agree with you, right? Because then, and you might even see this in some like cultures and stuff like that, people just become one big echo chamber, right? Wherever you go around people and they just blindly assume something to be true because they've never considered something different, right? That's not the way to go about history. This is flat earth thing, that's another great example, right? Because flat earthers, they mainly hang around with other flat earthers, right? And that's why they don't believe the world being round, because they don't, like, whenever somebody believes something different, they shut their ears off to it, right? They're not willing to actually hear the evidence. The only people they listen to are the ones who are sympathetic to their cause. We don't want to be like that, right? What I want as a historian is I want somebody to give me their best argument against the resurrection of Jesus, right? I want the best argument. Don't give me your weakest one. Give me your best one, right? Same thing like whenever people talk about the contradictions in the Bible, right? People will be like, there's a million Bible contradictions. I'll say, give me your best one. Don't, like, sometimes you'll be like, people will say, well, here's one, and then you'll answer it, oh, here's another one. Skip all that. Give me your best one, right? Give me your strongest argument against the Bible, and then I'll answer it, right? Because if you can answer their strongest argument, well, that's a good sign, because that means that the odds are in your favor, right? And so you don't want to simply talk with people who agree with you. You want to hear from people who disagree with you as well, because that'll help you be unbiased.
I think there's a parallel in science and the scientific method. That's a good thing. Peer-reviewed science journals. That the idea is you have to be able to reproduce your results. So you do the experiment, you get the results. But what if you do it one time? Oh, I got these results. I turned lead into gold. But everybody else tries what you did. No, it might, people lie sometimes. People make mistakes. So scientific, peer review is good because your peers can say, well, we're scientists, and what you did was either correct or incorrect.
Yeah. And that's why they do peer-reviewed journals.
Except this is just out of history. Other historians are saying, no, that's good.
Yeah. All right, fourthly, making one's horizon and method public allows for greater objectivity because it paves the way for discourse wherein subjective biases or blind spots may have governed how or why someone arrived at or favored certain hypotheses. What this means, you'll notice that the best way to be objective is by getting other people involved, right? This is why you have so many conspiracy theorists who are just like, 50-year-old dudes living in their mother's basement. Because the thing is, they're simply living there on their laptops. They're not talking with anybody else. They're simply reading all this stuff, and they're living in their own world, right? The best way to be objective is to get other people involved in the process, right? And if you can be public, and so whenever I'm going about this whole resurrection thing, I'm trying my best to set aside my Christian beliefs, but I'm also letting people know where I stand, right? Because if I let people know I am a Christian, well, that means that they can watch how I'm going about the process, and they might be able to highlight, and they say, hey, I noticed that you kind of, your Christian beliefs might have shaped how you viewed that thing, right? Because you assumed that Paul was telling the truth in 1 Corinthians, and not everybody holds that, right? And so by making it public, and by letting people know what your biases are, it allows other people to hold you accountable, right? And so that's another thing, right? You don't want to simply be like, you don't want to claim that you're unbiased. Right? Because that's the best way to first off just prove people that you're not being genuine. Because everybody's biased, right? And that's the issue, right? One thing about this that drives me nuts is, our pal Bart Ehrman, right? Bart Ehrman, he's agnostic, right? We've talked about him a lot whenever it comes to the why we believe in the Bible and stuff like that. Bart Ehrman drives me insane when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, right? Because on one hand, he admits that he's an agnostic, but he also tries his best to claim that he's unbiased. And that doesn't work. Because what he'll do with the resurrection is this, right? He will admit, and you can go look at his writings and you'll see where he says this. He'll say, if supernatural events are possible, then the resurrection of Jesus is without a doubt the most reasonable conclusion to come to given the historical data. But then he'll say, but since we know that supernatural events cannot happen, well, it only follows that any other explanation, even if less probable, has to be true. You see what the issue is there? He's going into it assuming supernatural events cannot happen. So, on one hand, he's claiming to be unbiased, but he's also severely biased, right? If you're he's trying to determine the historicity of a miracle, but he's going into the entire study assuming that miracles cannot happen. And so he's determining his conclusion prior to even looking at the evidence, and that's an issue.
Right.
You see how that's a problem? So he's claiming to be unbiased, but he's not really biased. Not unbiased. We don't want to do that, right? We want to admit from the forefront, this is our bias, right? We are Christians. We want the resurrection to be true. We believe in the supernatural. And we want to just make that clear that those are our biases so that if those biases are shaping our conclusions, somebody can call us out on it. And they can say, hey, I disagree with you right here. Okay, cool. Then you have to refine your argument. You see how, so that's helpful, right? It's not going to guarantee that you'll overcome those biases, but at the very least, it'll help other people see where you're biased, and it'll help them evaluate things, right? Which is good. And that's ultimately helpful in the long run. Fifthly, detachment from bias as much as possible, right, is necessary for objectivity, yet is one of the most difficult things to do since biases are not only difficult to overcome, but often even to recognize. One of the best ways to do this is by forcing themselves to confront data and arguments that are problematic to their preferred hypotheses. This is just basically kind of communicating what all of it's been talking about. We want to try to overcome our biases, right? If I recognize I want the resurrection to be true, the best way to overcome that bias is by reading a bunch of resources arguing that the resurrection is false, right? But that's not naturally what people do, right? Naturally, people go about trying to defend they'll go read all the resources arguing for their position, but that's not going to ultimately help them be unbiased. Because the thing is, all the people who are arguing those things are arguing for the same thing as them, right? And so what we need to do is we don't want to simply engage with the stuff that agrees with us. We want to engage with the other stuff too, right? Obviously, for the sake of making these PowerPoints, I mainly used sources that agree with the resurrection stuff. But the cool thing about those sources, specifically Mike Licaono's book, which is the thing I'm referencing most here, he engages with a lot of the unsympathetic stuff in the book, right? Which I really appreciate. And so even though I'm quoting from a resource that does agree with the Christian position, ultimately in the book, he's working with the unsympathetic things, which I just really appreciated. And I'll probably be quoting them and stuff as we go.
So trying to be a historian and trying to overlook the bias, if you're looking back to the resurrection, does that mean you're like, I think I've heard of Josephus, you want a Jewish historian, a Christian, a Roman, like don't you want other non-Christian sources?
Yes, well, I mean, if you can, yeah. And that's the cool thing is that we do have other sources. Ultimately, you've got to work with the sources that you have, sure. But if you only have Christian sources, right, you've got to evaluate that source with understanding that there's a possibility that they might be arguing in favor of their beliefs, right? And so that's the thing, right? That's why we're trying to approach it from a neutral perspective, right? Because you never know, right? You could argue, oh, maybe the early church did have an agenda where they were trying to prove this was true, right? You have to assume that, right? You don't have to assume that they had an agenda, but you have to assume that's a possibility, right?
I was just thinking you meant allow for other points of view to give yourself room to breathe. Like, what if you encountered a new perspective?
Well, the more perspectives you have, the better, sure, right? That's in general. The more evidence you have, it makes history a lot better, right? The cool thing is when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, the evidence that we have is you could argue that the resurrection of Jesus is one of the most solid pieces of historical evidence that we have, especially from 2,000 years ago. We'll get that when we get there. All right. Sixthly, accounting for the relevant historical bedrock aids in objectivity because it helps one ground their hypothesis on those bedrock facts which are so strongly evidenced that they are virtually indisputable. Any narrative unable to account for the historical bedrock should be returned to the drawing board or be relegated to the trash bin. What this means is that there are certain historical details that we know for a fact happened, right? And whatever hypothesis you are proposing needs to account for those. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing over the course of this study, right? The 5 facts I'm going to be telling you are all matters of historical bedrock, right? Practically every historian agrees that these 5 facts occurred, right? What we're going to do is we are going to propose a hypothesis, right? And we are going to say, does the resurrection of Jesus explain those 5 facts better than any other hypothesis, right? That's really what we're dealing with, right? So what we're mainly going to be doing is looking at the bedrock, and we're going to say, okay, this is the foundation that we're working with as historians. What best explains it, right? Because there's a bunch of theories, right? You can see this with like the pyramids, right? Everybody knows the pyramids exist, right? You've seen pictures of them, and if you don't believe in it, you can fly over to Egypt, you can see them, right? The pyramids exist, but people will debate about how they came to be, right? And there's certain historical details that we know, right? We know when they were built. We know how many years it took to build some of them. But the thing is, we don't know the names of the people who built them. And so we have to determine who exactly built these things. Well, some people will say that aliens came and built the pyramids. Well, other people will claim that, it was just Egyptians and that they were actually really technologically advanced and they were able to accomplish things that we could never even dream of accomplishing even now. One of those explains things better than the other, right? And so there's a certain historical bedrock, and people are going to have different hypotheses. Aliens versus the Egyptians. Obviously I would lean towards the Egyptians being a better explanation, but ultimately your historical method and stuff is going to shape that, right? Somebody who's more inclined towards conspiracy theories is obviously going to favor the aliens idea, right? And so that's what we have to work with. And so what is our historical method going to be? It is going to be something which is called the argument to the best explanation, right? And what that is this. The argument to the best explanation makes inferences and weighs hypotheses according to specific data so that the hypothesis that best meets the criteria is to be preferred and regarded as most likely to represent what occurred. So what this means is that we're going to look at all the historical evidence, and the way that we're going to evaluate this as historians is we're going to say which answer best explains all the other things, right? If you've got 5 different things and you've got to explain how these 5 things occurred, okay, well, how do you, which explanation best answers the question, right? That's what we're trying to go about, right? And there's different criteria that will help us do this, right? The first one is this, explanatory scope. It looks at the quantity of facts accounted for by a hypothesis. The hypothesis with the most relevant data has the greatest explanatory scope, right? Let's, just so I can explain this a little bit, let me give you an example, right? I'm going to tell you a few bedrock facts that happened today, and you're going to have to give your theory as to how this happened, right? All right. So this morning, I talked with Pastor Rob, my friend Luke, and my friend Ben. And while I was talking to Ben commented that Brienne seemed cold. All right. That's the information you know, right? So now you have to develop a theory, right? Okay, you know that I've talked to 3 people, right? I've talked with Pastor Rob. I've talked with Luke, who is the worship leader at my church, right? And I talked with Ben. And during my conversation with Ben, he remarked that Brienne seemed cold, right? Those are 4 bedrock facts that you know to be true, right? Based on the report that I gave you, right? Now what you have to do is you have to develop a hypothesis and figure out what circumstances would best explain those encounters. So, what situation do you think I was in where I could talk with Pastor Rob, Luke, and Ben saw that Brianna seemed cold?
I would assume you're at church, but not only because you said Pastor Rob, but I also assume knowledge that the other people you mentioned are people that go to church.
Bingo, right? That's probably the best explanation. But it's not the only one, right? So your hypothesis is that this occurred at church, right? And that's because if you looked into the evidence, you would see that Luke is the worship leader at the church, and Pastor Rob is the pastor of that same church, and Ben goes to that church with us. Brienne also goes to that church, and if you went there, you would see that the church is often very cold, and that Brienne gets cold very easily, right? And so that has very good explanatory scope, because that explanation explains a whole lot of the facts, right? right?
Conspiracies, that's your theory.
Yeah, but think about this, right? What if you were to say another hypothesis, right? What if you said you were talking to them outside the church? All right, well, that would account for me talking to Pastor Rob and Luke and Ben, but you know what it doesn't account for? Brianne being cold, because we're in Texas in the summer, and it's not cold outside,
Almost
right?
Maybe winter a little bit.
No, but the thing is, I said that was today, right? And so, it's hot outside, and y'all know this. And so, that is a credible hypothesis, but it doesn't have a good explanatory scope. However, you know what it does have better explanatory scope then? If you said that this was at my house. Okay, well, I guess that could account for maybe Brianne being cold, and we know that Ben is at my house, and we know that, Brianne comes over here, but there's some issues there, because now you've got to explain why Pastor Rob and Luke were at my house on a Sunday morning when they should have been at church, and why me, Ben, and Brianne weren't there when we should have been at church, right? And so, of those theories, the last one has the least explanatory scope. I mean, yeah, it's a valid hypothesis, but it doesn't have good explanatory scope, right?
I think something with what Paul mentioned was that if you're giving a report, that means anything else that we know to be true could be a counter report. So you're reporting today here in Texas, but what about I ask your neighbor? I know something else is true.
Yeah.
They might have contrary evidence.
Yeah.
That could be false.
Well, and that's why we look at as much evidence as we have,
Sure.
right? Because you could talk to Brianne. Like, if you were to go interview Brianne and you could ask her details, well, she might even mention that she saw Ben at church, in which case you're like, you're stringing it together. Does that make sense? Right? And so the explanatory scope is basically you're saying which hypothesis best accounts for the facts,
There you go, Matthew,
right?
Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah, exactly, right? So it's super helpful. So if you're looking at just this example I gave you, the hypothesis that has the least explanatory scope is it being at my house. Because yes, it's plausible, but it doesn't explain why the pastor and the worship leader were not at church. It doesn't explain why Ben, Brianne, and me were not at church whenever we typically go to church on Sundays. And I mean, the only thing it really accounts for is that we all saw each other and that it might have been cold, because Brianne sometimes gets cold here, right? The one with more explanatory scope is that we saw outside the church, but the one with the best explanatory scope is that we talked to each other inside the church, because it makes sense for the inside of the church to be cold, right? And so that hypothesis has the best explanatory scope, right? Secondly, explanatory power. It looks at the quality of the explanation of the facts. The hypothesis that explains the data with the least amount of effort, vagueness, and ambiguity has greater explanatory power. You can look at that with the same hypotheses, right? Let's just look at the first two I shared, right? So on one hand, you're hypothesizing that I talked to everybody outside the church, right? Well, now you have to explain why Brianne was cold outside the church. Okay, so now you're having to hypothesize some more, right? So you're having to go further, and you're saying, well, maybe Brianne is sick and she had a fever, and she had chills because of that. Or maybe she was playing outside with the kids for a really long time, she got heat exhaustion, and she started getting chills, right? So you're explaining stuff, but it doesn't have as much explanatory power as simply saying they were inside the church.
Right.
Because being inside the church gives you a clear understanding for this, right? It's like, oh, yeah, they're inside the church, it's cold, right? So the power of the, it's not as much of a stretch, right? It's simply, okay, yeah, I mean, that accounts for all the details, right? And so that's what we're looking for. Not only does it account for a high quantity, but the quality of the explanations are better, right? You're not having to stretch things out. You're not having to barely think things. Or you could highlight, oh, well, David simply said that Ben thought Brianne looked cold, but Brianne wasn't actually cold. She just looked cold, right? And so you could explain that way, but once again, that's a worse explanation, right? And so not only are we looking for the hypothesis that has the higher quantity when it comes to explanation, but we're also looking for better quality too, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, so those are the things we're looking at. Thirdly, plausibility. It assesses whether other areas known with confidence suggest a certain hypothesis. The hypothesis must be implied to a greater degree and by a greater variety of accepted truths or background knowledge than other hypotheses. All right. So what this means is that it has to be at least plausible, right? And so I'm trying to think. So the one about being outside. right? I would say that is less plausible because, once again, we know that it's cold outside, right? Since it is cold outside, it's not as plausible that Brienne would be cold outside unless there were other details, right? Or sorry, it's hot. Sorry, it's hot outside. It's not likely that Brienne would be cold if it's so hot outside unless there were other things that were wrong with her, in which case I probably would have mentioned that, right? And so it's less plausible.
If I said I went to Chick-fil-A on Sunday, had a meal.
Yes, exactly. That's perfect, right? Yeah, so if George, for some reason, didn't show up to discipleship group tonight, and we saw him on Tuesday, and we said, where were you on Sunday night? And he said, oh, I'm sorry, I went and got Chick-fil-A dinner with my dad. Well, we would know that that's very implausible, right? And he just lied to us because Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays, right? So that's a perfect example, right? It's implausible. There are certain bedrock data that we know, right? And so it's like, that's a lie.
In Texas,
right?
That's a fact.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, hypothetically, let's say that you were proposing that this all happened at my house, but you know what Pastor Rob would say? I've never been to David's house, right? So that's implausible, right? I've never been to David's house, therefore, that is not a valid theory, right? And so we're looking for something that is actually plausible, right? Whenever you're looking at the bedrock data, you have to account for that. If it violates something else, right, well then, so if I told you, all right, here's the bedrock data. I talked to Pastor Rob, I talked to Luke, I talked to Ben. Ben thought Brienne looked cold, and Pastor Rob has never been to my house, right? If those were the 5 things I told you, well, all of a sudden, that rules out that third hypothesis, right? Because that third hypothesis is no longer plausible, because if you said that we talked at my house, that would contradict what we knew to be fact, right? And so it's no longer plausible.
I think a lot of the Gospels being set in Jerusalem, historically that's plausible because we know about the Romans being in power in that area at that time. And if that regional history is correct, then it's plausible. I'm not saying it's correct, but it's a possibility.
So you can actually do all these steps when it comes to just examining the truth claims of the Gospels themselves, because whenever you actually examine the Gospels from a strictly historical perspective, you can tell that they were written by first century Jews. Like, even if hypothetically we did not know even if we were to discover the Gospels for the first time today, there are details within those Gospels that would confirm to us that they were written in the first century, just because there are certain things that the Gospel authors know that you would not know unless you were in that place at that time, right? Which is really cool. And so we're going to be doing this in regards to the resurrection, but you can do this in regards to literally anything in the Bible.
Like the Old Testament has facts.
Yeah. All right. Fourthly, less ad hoc, right? Ad hoc, like what you're going for is you're looking for simplicity, right? So whenever we're saying things are less ad hoc, we are favoring hypotheses that do not go beyond what the data warrants, those which require fewer presuppositions. A hypothesis possesses an ad hoc component when it enlists non-evidence assumptions, that is, when it goes beyond what is already known. Perfect example of this is the one I was talking about a second ago, whenever somebody was saying, well, they were talking outside, right? The ad hoc component is whenever you're saying, the reason Brienne looked cold is because she had COVID for the last 3 months, and she had severe chills, and even though it was blazing hot outside, she felt extremely chilly. That's ad hoc, right? Because it's a big stretch, right? You're making a bunch of stuff up, and you're overcomplicating it when there is a simpler explanation.
You know where I find these explanations a lot of times? Is like Wikipedia, and it's like source citation needed.
Yeah.
And if people do that, they'll just throw out random facts they just made up.
Yeah.
Totally fictional. And you're like, no, I'm going to need some data, citation needed.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, there are times when situations are more complex than it might seem. But the thing is, if you're going to choose the more complex one, you have to show how the evidence leads you there. Right? Does that make you sense?
Yep.
Right? So if you're looking at those two theories that we talked inside the church or outside the church, if you're going to favor the idea that we talked outside the church, you're going to have to explain why you favor that one. Because there's an easier explanation. Right? The easier explanation is that we were inside the church and she was cold because they were inside the church. Right? If you're going to favor that she had severe chills outside, okay, what is it about the evidence that leads you to that? Right? Or are you just blindly choosing it? Right? That's the issue, right? And some people will do that, right? Some people will just, they'll come up with these huge conspiracy theories, and you'll see this when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, right? Some of the prominent theories that we'll hear is that people will say, one theory is the twin theory, right? That throughout the Gospels, even though the Bible never mentions it, Jesus had a secret twin, right? And so when Jesus died, he died and was buried, but then his twin showed up, and that is who the disciples actually saw. That's a theory that people genuinely propose. You know what the issue is with that? It's super complex, and there's no evidence for it. Right? Because first off, I mean, Jesus' mother was there. You think that she didn't know that she had twins? Right? Also, the disciples of Jesus, I mean, they would have known if he had a twin. Why would they go die for, and also, okay, if there was a twin, then where's the body? Right? Once again, you still have that issue. Where's the body at? Right? And so there's all these theories that people propose like that, and it's a really complex theory, and people will be like, that makes perfect sense. Until you think about it, right?
I'm going to apply this theory and see if this is less ad hoc. So, comparing conspiracy, what does the historian say is the evidence for aliens building the pyramid versus are there factual historians, like good historians that have claims of a resurrection?
Yeah. Or here's a good explanation, right? One time I was getting a massage, right? And during the massage, this guy, like the massage therapist, he just looked at me and he said, "Hey, I just want to let you know." He was talking to me about like what my job was. I told him I taught Bible and stuff, and he said, I've got some weird views about God. And whenever somebody starts off a conversation like that, you know it's going to be a wild ride. And so he asked me, he said, "Hey, do you why do you think it is that historically speaking, God has been presented as a white man, like an old white man with a white beard, right?" And I'm just like getting this massage, and I respond to him and I say, well, I think the main reason why that is the case is because, the Renaissance time period was the most influential period of art on modern culture, and the Renaissance was mainly taking place in Europe, and so whenever Europeans depicted God, they depicted what they pictured as a super wise man. Whenever they thought of wise people, they thought of old dudes with white beards. Right? And so I said, that's why, right? Historically speaking, and the thing is, we just know that's why. That is 100% correct, right? It's because the Renaissance was so influential. If you actually go over to, Africa at that time period, they depicted God with darker skin, right? But the reason why you typically see God depicted as, an old guy with a white beard is because the Renaissance has influenced so much stuff, right? It's like Italian dudes painting what they depict as the wisest person in the world. And the guy responded to me, he says, well, that's a better explanation than I thought of. And I was like, what was your explanation? And he said, well, I thought that sometime in the future we develop time travel. And we travel back in time, and we show people our amazing technology, and they assume that we are gods, and therefore they depict us as gods. Do you see how his is more ad hoc? It's less simple, right? There are so many things that he's having to account for, and it's a huge stretch, whereas my explanation, it's a very simple explanation. It's like, well, the Renaissance was popular, they painted it that way, and it's influenced our cultures. Boom. Whereas he's like, no. So we're looking for the less ad hoc one, right? And if you're going to choose one that is more complex, the evidence has to favor that. Fifthly and lastly, illumination. Illumination recognizes that sometimes a hypothesis provides a possible solution to other problems without confusing other areas held with confidence. Conclusions in one area may have far-reaching effects on others. This is whenever you know that you have found the perfect theory, right? Because it actually explains other stuff, right? To where it might not even be explaining exactly what you were trying to figure out there, right? I'm trying to think if I can give an example with a theory that we've been running with. Let's see. What? No. I was thinking about the example of us being at church. Okay, so let me add some more details, right?
Yeah.
And so, let's say that these are the details I told you. I talked to Pastor Rob. I talked to Luke. I talked to Ben. Ben thought Brienne looked cold, and we had to talk a little bit louder to talk over the music, right? Okay, right. And so those are the 5 details I tell you. Right? Well, the main thing that you're trying to figure out is where this took place at, right? Where the conversation took place at, right? But in guessing where the conversation took place at the church, that accounts for other details you weren't even trying to explain. You weren't necessarily trying to explain why Brienne looked cold, right? That was simply a detail that I mentioned, right? But being at church helps explain that. It's like, oh, that explains why Brienne was cold. And being at church also explains, or this, right? If you were to say, because you could refine your theory, not only were we talking at church, we were talking in between, like before the service started, right? Because that explains some stuff, right? Because not only are that, like, us being at church explains why Brienne was cold, but us talking before the sermon started explains why there was music in the background, because they're rehearsing music, right? And so your main thing is you're trying to figure out when this happened and where this happened, but in presenting your theory, it's actually explaining other stuff you weren't even trying to explain, right? You weren't trying to explain why Brienne was cold. You weren't trying to explain why there was music in the background, but in giving your theory, it happened to explain that as well. And what we're going to see with the resurrection is that if the resurrection happened, it actually helps explain other details as well, right? For instance, it explains why the apostles would go on and die for this, right? Like, think about so the most common theory that people propose about against the resurrection is the stolen body hypothesis, right? This is the theory that the earliest Jews promoted, and this is the most common one that people suggest now, right? And they will say the body of Jesus was stolen from the tomb. And you've got to find a way to argue against that, right? And the cool thing is that there's a bunch of evidence that proves that the body was not stolen, right? Just by itself. But the cool thing is, whenever you prove that the body was not stolen, that also explains why the apostles would go and die for their faith. Because if they did steal the body, now you've got a whole issue. Because you've got to figure out why people would go and die for something that they knew to be false, right? Whereas the resurrection theory actually illuminates why they would go die for their faith, especially whenever you consider the fact that the night before Jesus was crucified, the apostles had like their worst moment ever, right? I mean, Judas betrayed Jesus, Peter denied him 3 times, all of them fled from him, and then Jesus dies. If anything, that should make them more afraid. And sure enough, whenever you see them 3 days later, you know where they're at? They're in a room locked away. They're in hiding. And so now you've got to explain not only why these people went and died for their faith, but how did they go from being such cowards to being such martyrs, right? On one hand, they're afraid to even associate themselves with Jesus, and then for some reason after his death, they're willing to die for him? Well, that's weird. But if you can explain that the tomb was empty, well, that helps explain that. Oh, well, if they saw a resurrected Jesus, well, that would probably soothe your fears and make you go die for him, right? And so it illuminates things, right? And so those are the things we're trying to do. If we can explain things in that way, that will arrive you at the argument for the best explanation, right? We are looking for the one that it accounts for the most quantity of facts. It provides the best quality of arguments. It is plausible, right? It's simpler, and it illuminates things, right? If we can find a theory that does all those things, we have found a really good theory. And so this is what Mike Licona says. Historians are rarely able to demonstrate that certain hypotheses are impossible. They render conclusions by determining which hypothesis fulfills criteria for the best explanation better than its competitors and holds that conclusion as provisional. Historians using arguments to the best explanation should weigh each hypothesis according to how well it meets these 5 criteria. The hypothesis fulfilling the most criteria, especially the more weighty ones, is to be preferred. All right, and so I think this is the last thing I want to cover real quick. One thing that's going to help us when it comes to this is some criterion of authenticity. How do we determine whether or not something is more likely or less likely to have happened, right? We need to figure that out. Criterion of authenticity are various methods employed to help demonstrate the historical plausibility and probability of an event. And some of them I've already referred to, right? Probably the one that's going to be most useful for us whenever it comes to examining the Gospels is the criterion of embarrassment, right? It's a form of analysis wherein a historical account is deemed more likely to be true because it is less likely for an author to invent a historical account which might embarrass them, right? One example of this is, let's say, hypothetically speaking, I told you that even though you didn't know it, last week I competed in the Olympics. Most likely I'm lying, right? Because I have no evidence to prove that, and I would have every reason to make it up because it makes me look really good, right? Wow, David's a way better athlete than I thought. Okay. But what if I told you another story? And I told you that one time I was competing in the Spartan Race World Championships, And I was so stupid that whenever I went out there, I didn't bring any nutrition with me. And 2 hours into the race, I just like basically hit this wall and I stumbled in a crazy, like just like weird headspace through the woods until I eventually crossed the finish line. That's more likely to be true. And that actually is a true story, right? And the reason you know it's more likely to be true is because it doesn't make me look good at all, right? It makes me look really bad. Because I'm stupid. I should have brought nutrition with me out on the course. Why didn't I do that, right? I made it all the way to the World Championship race. I should have known better, right? And so that doesn't make me look good. It's more likely to be false. Well, what we're going to see throughout the Gospels is that the Gospel authors aren't trying to make themselves look good, right? Matthew describes himself as a tax collector, right? Peter, I mean, he's the leader of the church, and he's denying Jesus 3 times, right? And so whenever you're looking at it, you got to consider the criterion of embarrassment. If somebody tells you that they peed their pants, they probably did, because they're not upping their social status by telling you that, right? They're embarrassing themselves, and they probably have an issue that they need to take care of, right? And so the criterion of embarrassment is super helpful for us. Secondly, the criterion of multiple independent reports. The criterion of multiple independent reports is built upon the principle that the likelihood of a saying or event being historical increases if that saying or event is recorded in several different independent sources. This is what we were just talking about with George, right? The more sources you have that are separate from one another, the better, right? So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are separate sources, but they're somewhat related to one another, and we can't really determine that relationship. And so some people would consider those separate, some people would consider them together, right? However, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are separate from 1 Corinthians, right? Those are 2 independent accounts for sure. You could argue Matthew, Mark, and Luke are 3 separate independent accounts, but those are different, right? However, those are all from Christian authors, right? Whenever you go to Josephus, well, he talks about Jesus too, and he's not even a Christian. He's a Jewish person writing in the 1st century. And so now what you can do is you can take all these different reports that were written independently from people with different horizons, and that'll help you be more objective.
I know it's a bit out there, but I take the whole Bible this way in account in reference to God, that there's 66 books written by multiple authors over multiple lands, time, and different languages, that if there's 66 different writings, like, that's not just one person, and they come to similar conclusions.
That's what many people fail to account for, is that even if you don't believe the Bible is the Word of God, it is historical evidence, right? No matter what, right? Because nobody claims the Bible just like poofed out of nowhere, right? It's historical evidence, and at some point somebody sat down to write it, right? So regardless of whether you're a Christian, an atheist, or anything, it is historical evidence that you have to examine. And it's not just one book, like you pointed out. It's 66 different books. And some of those books reference older things, right? And so that's really cool. And then a criterion of dissimilarity. The criterion of dissimilarity holds that if a saying or event is more likely to originate with Jesus himself, if it is different from the Judaism before him and also the early Christians after him, right? What this means is that there are certain claims that Jesus makes that are really just unprecedented, right? Things that he said that are way different than what people expected, right? So whenever Jesus goes around claiming to be the Son of God, it seems to ring true that he actually claimed to be that, because no Jewish people expected him to do that, right? But then there's also some things that Jesus claims, or things that Jesus says, that are different than what we see the early church talking about, right? Because Jesus might have emphasized something that wasn't as big of a deal a few years later when the early church was founded. And so if you can find something that Jesus says that differs from the Judaism before him or the Christianity after him, it's more likely that that's to be true, because we see that it's not just like somebody forcing all these things to tie together, right? It's not like a plot hole, but it's the same mentality as a plot hole, right? It's not saying that it's like inconsistent, because we obviously believe the Bible's consistent, but it means that it sticks out like a sore thumb, right? You're like, wow, one of these things is not like the other, right? The Jewish people didn't expect the Messiah to look like this, but Jesus is showing up claiming this. Well, that's cool. I would say this about the virgin birth, right? Jesus being born of a virgin, I would say that is the criterion of dissimilarity, because Matthew quotes Isaiah chapter 7, right? And he says, this fulfilled the prophecy, the virgin shall give birth to a son. The issue is, if you go read Isaiah's passage, you would never assume that's about the Messiah, right? And if you look at the Jewish people at that time period, none of them believed the Messiah was going to be born of a virgin. And so, if the Christians are saying that Jesus was born of a virgin, that would seem to suggest that he actually was, because they would have no reason to make that up, right? There were so many other prophecies they could have forced him to fulfill, but instead they had him fulfilling one that nobody would have even expected as a prophecy, right? So that would suggest that it actually did happen, right? Which is pretty cool. And so that's everything we're covering for tonight. And then starting next week, we are going to begin looking at the first fact that we can know about Jesus, and that is specifically that he died a death by crucifixion, right? And so we will talk about that next week. Sound good?
Yes.
Right. Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. As we go into this study, I pray that you will give us sober minds, and will just equip us to do all the things that you would have us do, and do it rightly. Help us set aside our horizons and overcome our biases, God, and ultimately approach this as objectively as possible so that you can receive the greatest glory whenever we get to the end. We love you, we praise you, in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.